The Zither ship descended slowly through Earth's atmosphere, an enormous, sleek vessel that cut through the sky like a jagged shard of obsidian. It hovered above the battered city below, casting a long shadow over the ruins. From a distance, it looked like a ship straight out of a human's most fevered sci-fi dreams or nightmares, depending on how you felt about intergalactic invaders. Inside, the Zither crew moved with clinical precision, their six-limbed bodies working in harmony. Commander Zalvik, the leader of the expedition, stood at the helm. His glossy green skin reflected the dim lights of the ship, and his large black eyes flickered with something between curiosity and mild exasperation. He had made the decision to send his elite team down to Earth to observe the humans, to study why they kept fighting when all logic dictated surrender. Any updates? Zalvik's voice, deep and authoritative, echoed through the command room. Sir, our sensors confirm the humans are engaged in combat as we speak, responded Zira, his tactical officer. They're holding their ground rather admirably, considering the circumstances. Zalvik made a sound that could have been a sigh, though, for the Zither, it was more like a low-frequency hum. Admire what, exactly? Their will to die. Zira hesitated before responding, unsure if the commander was serious or sarcastic. They seem to fight for something beyond survival, sir. Fascinating, Zalvik muttered. Set the course. I want to see it for myself. On the ground, Sergeant Grace Carter had seen enough war to fill several lifetimes. She stood crouched behind the wreckage of an old military truck, the acrid smell of burning fuel mixing with the ever-present scent of desperation. The Zither had been relentless, but so had the humans. They fought like cornered animals, scrappy and vicious. You think we can take them down, Sergeant? Private Jamal asked, peeking over the truck's hood. His voice was a mix of hope and disbelief, like a kid asking if he could take on a school bully twice his size. We gotta try, Grace replied, checking the ammo on her rifle. She had learned long ago that the human spirit was the only weapon she could rely on. Everything else could be replaced or destroyed, but that, the human will, was unbreakable. She turned toward her squad. All right, people, you know the plan? We hit them hard, fast, and when they think they've won, we hit them again. We got to show them that they might have the tech, but we've got heart. There was a chorus of nods and murmurs. Grace knew that morale was a fragile thing in times like these, but she had learned how to keep it steady. The humans had something the Zither didn't, an unyielding belief in themselves, in their homes, in each other. She wasn't about to let that go. The battle raged on. Humans scattered across the crumbling streets, their movements chaotic yet purposeful. The Zither, however, weren't easily impressed. They had conquered entire worlds, reduced civilizations to ash, and even now, their superior weapons made human technology look like children's toys. Their laser cannons fired precision shots that incinerated anything in their path, and yet the humans, they just kept coming. From the safety of their ship high above, the Zither watched, baffled. I don't understand, Zira muttered, reviewing the data. Their tactics are primitive. They should have retreated by now. Zalvik shook his head. It's not about tactics. It's about something else. We need to get closer. By the time the Zither ship landed in the city's center, the humans were still fighting. Grace and her squad had pushed back the Zither forces for now, but they knew it was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. What they didn't know was that they were about to meet a different kind of enemy, the kind that didn't shoot lasers, but instead analyzed their every move with cold, calculating eyes. Zalvik and his team disembarked from the ship, their gleaming bodies emerging from the darkened craft. The humans froze at the sight of them, but Grace stood firm. She had been in the trenches long enough to recognize the weight of a situation before it got out of hand. What do you want? She asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She didn't raise her weapon. There was no need. She was ready to face whatever came next, just like always. Zalvik studied her for a moment, his large black eyes scanning every inch of her as if she were a puzzle to be solved. We are here to understand, he said. His voice was deep, strange to human ears, but there was an odd softness to it. Why do you fight? Why do you resist? Grace smirked. You want to know why we fight? She glanced at her squad. who were all watching the zither warily. We fight because we're human, and that's what we do. We don't give up. Ever. Zalvik tilted his head, intrigued. But you are losing. You have lost more soldiers than you can replace. Your technology is no match for ours. Your tactics are inefficient. Grace couldn't help but laugh, the sound ringing out in the air. Inefficient? That's cute. You've never seen humans fight when they're angry. I am serious, Zalvik replied, his tone now more contemplative. Why do you fight when the odds are against you? Grace's expression softened just a fraction, a flicker of something like pity crossing her face. It's simple. We fight because we don't know how not to. When you have nothing left but each other, you fight for each other. We fight for freedom, for our homes, and because someone has to. You can't just take everything from us and expect us to lie down. The Zither leader stared at her, his mind working to process this new information. There was something in her eyes, something fierce, something real, that he couldn't quite understand. Fascinating, he murmured. Perhaps we have much more to learn from you than we thought. Grace raised an eyebrow. Oh, you'll learn. But let's hope it's not the hard way. The sun was barely a sliver on the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the war-torn city. The streets, once bustling with life, were now nothing more than craters and broken asphalt, littered with debris and the occasional charred vehicle. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Grace Carter adjusted the strap on her rifle, its weight familiar in her hands. She crouched low behind the remnants of a collapsed building, eyes scanning the horizon. Her squad was positioned around her, tense but ready. It had been 3 days since they'd last seen the Zither up close, and Grace was certain that today would not be any easier. All right, people, she muttered into her comms. Eyes sharp, ears open. We got one shot at this. Private Jamal, ever the optimist, piped up. One shot, huh? Are we sure it's going to be enough? I mean, we're outgunned, outnumbered, and... Jamal. Grace cut him off, her voice calm but firm. Focus. We have one shot, and we're going to take it. In the distance, a low hum began to vibrate through the ground. The unmistakable sound of Zither hovercraft. Jamal's joking demeanor vanished, replaced with that familiar edge of anxiety that only came when the enemy was close. He glanced nervously at Grace. You sure this is the best spot, Sergeant? The last time we tried this, I nearly broke my leg diving into that hole. Grace rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a smile. Jamal, the hole was big enough for a squad. You're just creatively clumsy. Focus. Just then, the first Zither ship appeared, its sleek metallic form gliding silently toward the ground. A second followed, then a third, until the air was thick with their looming presence. Grace could see them now, their six-limbed soldiers disembarking with methodical precision, their weaponry gleaming. They had come to finish what they had started. Brace yourselves, Grace said, her voice quieter now, the weight of the moment sinking in. As the Zither forces advanced, her squad remained perfectly still, holding their breath. They'd been running out of resources for weeks, scavenging what little they could, but there was no backing down. Not today. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught Grace's eye. A lone Zither soldier, taller and broader than most, detached from the main group and marched forward, seemingly with purpose. His sharp mandibles clicked as his head swiveled from side to side, scanning for movement. Grace could almost feel the disdain radiating off him. The Zither didn't understand humans, and that ignorance, she thought, was their downfall. Now, Grace whispered, and the air erupted in gunfire. Her squad opened fire from the shadows, the crack of their rifles piercing the silence. The Zither stumbled, their shields absorbing the first wave of bullets, but it didn't matter. The humans had been waiting. Jamal's shot was the first to hit, taking down a smaller Zither scout with surprising accuracy. You sure you're not secretly a sharpshooter, Jamal? Grace called out, her rifle barking in rhythm with his. I mean, it's kind of my thing, Jamal said, grinning. But don't get used to it. Grace didn't have time to respond. The Zither had regrouped quickly, returning fire with devastating precision. The first blast narrowly missed Grace's head, and she instinctively ducked behind a wall of rubble, her heart pounding in her chest. "Heads up!" Jamal yelled, and Grace followed his line of sight, just in time to see a Zither soldier charging toward their position, a massive plasma cannon in hand. "Not on my watch," she muttered under her breath. With a quick motion, she pulled a grenade from her belt and lobbed it toward the Zither. It exploded midair, sending a shockwave of energy through the street and knocking the soldier off his feet. The explosion sent a gust of wind that kicked up dust and debris, giving Grace just the opening she needed. The squad didn't miss the chance. They stormed forward, guns blazing, every step measured, every move purposeful. The Zither seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the humans, their usually calculated reactions thrown off by the unpredictability of their opponents. Jamal grinned, his rifle resting on his shoulder as he fired a few rounds into the air. "You're not so tough now, are we?" The Zither regrouped, their leaders barking orders into their comms, but the humans weren't letting up. Grace led the charge, her boots pounding against the cracked pavement, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something more than the weight of survival. She felt alive. She turned a corner and came face to face with a towering Zither warrior. The creature snarled, raising its plasma rifle, but Grace was faster. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, and fired 3 quick shots into the Zither's chest. The impact knocked the creature off balance, its mandibles clicking in frustration. Grace wasted no time, running up to it and delivering a swift kick to its side, sending it crashing to the ground. "Is that all you've got?" Grace taunted, her breath steady despite the chaos around her. The Zither soldier, now dazed and disoriented, let out a final, frustrated hiss. "Foolish," it muttered, its voice barely audible. But before it could rise, Grace's squad converged, surrounding the fallen soldier. Jamal had a mischievous grin on his face. "I think it's safe to say they're not exactly fan club material, Sergeant." Grace chuckled, her adrenaline starting to fade into an exhaustion she couldn't quite shake. She turned back toward the rest of the battlefield, where the tide was slowly shifting in their favor. The Zither were disorganized, rattled by the human tenacity they hadn't anticipated. "We might just win this one," Jamal said, eyes wide in disbelief as the Zither forces started to retreat. "Let's not get cocky," Grace replied, her voice low but full of resolve. "We got a long way to go before this is over." But as the Zither ships began to pull back into the sky, their retreat signaling a rare victory for the humans, Grace couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. They had fought against all odds, and for the first time in weeks, the humans had won. "Good work, everyone," she said, her voice steady, but there was something almost like warmth in it. "Let's get ready. We got a bigger fight ahead." The Zither ships hovered in silence above the war-torn city, their metallic frames reflecting the orange glow of a setting sun. Below them, the humans were celebrating their unlikely victory, shouting to each other in exuberant relief. For a moment, there was an odd stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath. From their vantage point, Commander Zalvik and his team watched with a growing sense of bewilderment. "Fascinating," Zalvik muttered, his black eyes scanning the battlefield below. "They've won somehow. With inferior technology and resources, they still managed to push us back. Why?" Zira, his tactical officer, gave a nervous glance at the rest of the crew. "It's hard to say, Commander. The humans are, well, irrational. Their strategies are chaotic." And yet, she trailed off, still processing what they had just witnessed. "Exactly." Zalvik's voice was low, but filled with awe. "They fight not because they must, but because they choose to. They are motivated by something we cannot comprehend." Zira shifted uncomfortably. "Are you saying we are missing something? That their courage is contagious?" "Something like that," Zalvik said, rubbing his elongated chin. "They aren't motivated by cold logic or strategy. They're motivated by emotion, loyalty, perhaps even love." The word love lingered in the air for a moment, almost alien in its weight. "They were willing to die for one another," Zalvik continued, almost to himself. "And in that, they were more dangerous than I ever anticipated." His crew fell silent, reflecting on his words. The commander's mind was spinning. He'd studied countless species before, each one driven by the same basic principles: survival, power, or efficiency. But this was something else entirely. The humans didn't just want to win. They wanted to protect, to preserve, and that made them an enigma. On the ground, Grace Carter sat with her squad in the shadows of a destroyed building. They were exhausted, battered, but alive. They had made it through the first round, against all odds. Now, they had a few moments of relative peace before the next battle would begin. "Man, that was insane," Jamal said, leaning back against a pile of rubble. "I mean, I've fought in some tough spots, but that was like something out of a bad action movie. Did you see the way I took out that zither?" "Nailed it." Grace grinned, though it was more out of weariness than amusement. "Sure, Jamal. You were great. Don't let it go to your head." "Me?" Jamal said with mock offense. "I'm humble. Totally humble. Just a humble, deadly force of nature." "Keep it up," Grace replied, shaking her head. "You'll have a big ego by the end of this war, if you don't already." At that, the squad chuckled, their laughter filling the hollow space between them. It was an unexpected moment of calm in the midst of chaos. And yet, even as the banter flowed, Grace couldn't help but notice the unsettling silence from above. The zither had retreated, but something in the air felt different, like the storm hadn't passed, but merely paused. "Something's off," she muttered under her breath. Jamal, always the optimist, didn't pick up on the same tension. "Come on, Sarge, what's wrong with you? We just took down their big guns. We should be celebrating." Grace's eyes narrowed as she scanned the sky. "The zither don't retreat. Not like that. They're planning something." High above them, the zither were indeed planning, but it was not an attack. Zalvik stood in his ship's command center, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the humans, how they fought, how they moved, how they seemed to draw strength from their camaraderie. It was unnerving, almost unsettling, and entirely unexpected. The zither were known for their cold, logical approach to war. They had crushed civilizations, dismantled empires. But these humans, they were something else. "Commander," Zira spoke up hesitantly, pulling him from his thoughts. "We've gathered all the data. Their tactics, their weapons, their movements. It's all remarkable. But what do we do with it?" Zalvik's gaze remained fixed on the human settlement below. He was no longer just a commander. He was a student of humanity. "We learn from them," he said, his voice firm, yet oddly intrigued. "These creatures, they're not like us. We can't win by following the same patterns." Zira blinked, struggling to follow. "Learn? From them? You want us to adopt their irrationality?" Zalvik's expression softened, just a touch. "Irrational? No, Zira. They are not irrational. They are driven by something deeper. We've never truly understood the concept of loyalty, not like they do. The way they defend each other is not simply survival instinct. It's something greater." Zira was silent for a long moment. "Are you saying we should adopt their behavior? Fight like they do?" Zalvik's mouth curved slightly, though it was not a smile. "No, we will never fight like they do. But we will observe, and we will understand. Because if we don't, we'll never truly defeat them. Not like this." Back on Earth, Grace and her squad were still keeping watch. The tension in the air hadn't eased, and Grace couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the zither weren't finished with them. Something about their retreat felt rehearsed, calculated. They had to be preparing for another assault, even if it wasn't immediate. "All right, people," Grace said, standing up and checking her rifle. "We get some rest while we can, but stay sharp. The next round's coming sooner than we think." Jamal leaned back and stretched. "You know, Sarge, maybe you're right about the zither. They're tough, but maybe they're not used to dealing with humans. We got something they don't." Grace raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "And what's that, Jamal?" "Guts," Jamal said, his grin wide. "We got guts, and they're starting to notice." Grace couldn't argue with that. The zither were learning, and that, she thought, was both their advantage and their greatest challenge. Zalvik stood alone in the command room, staring down at the battlefield through the large viewing screen. His fingers danced lightly over the holographic controls, adjusting the magnification to focus on the humans below. The zither had seen many forms of combat, Plenty of worlds had fallen under their boots. Yet this human resistance was unlike anything he had encountered. What drove them? What made them fight with such fierce abandon, even when the odds were so clearly against them? Zira approached from behind, her voice laced with both uncertainty and curiosity. "Commander, you've been studying them for hours. Are we any closer to understanding?" Zalvik didn't immediately answer. He was deep in thought, watching as humans moved through the wreckage, checking on their fallen comrades and regrouping for the inevitable counterattack. It wasn't the tactics that confused him. It wasn't even their primitive weaponry. No, it was something more elusive, a kind of intensity in their movements, in their eyes. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's not their tactics, Zira. They don't fight for land or power or even survival. They fight because they believe in something. They fight for each other." Zira blinked. "But their survival is at risk. They've lost so many. Isn't that their reason?" Zalvik shook his head. "No. They fight because they don't know how to stop. When one falls, another steps up. When they're surrounded, they keep fighting. They don't retreat. They don't surrender. They don't even consider it. They fight not because they have to, but because they refuse to lose." Zira frowned. "And how do we defeat them, Commander? If we don't understand why they fight, how can we win?" Zalvik took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the humans below once more. "We need to understand their source of strength. If we can tap into that, perhaps we can unravel them from the inside." On the ground, Grace Carter wiped the sweat from her brow, feeling the ache in her muscles. The battle had been long, and the Zithir were still relentless. But they were human, and if there was one thing humans knew, it was how to endure. The city had been reduced to a skeleton of its former self, but in that rubble, Grace found a certain kind of solace. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were holding the line. "Sergeant, we're getting low on ammo," Jamal called, checking his weapon and looking over at her with wide eyes. "We can't keep this up forever." Grace glanced at her squad. They were bruised, tired, but they were still here. They weren't running. "Not yet. We've been up against worse odds," she replied with a wink, trying to keep her tone light. "Besides, we've got one thing the Zithir don't." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Grace's smile grew. "A reason to fight, right?" Jamal muttered, cracking his knuckles. "Not sure if I'm sold on heart and soul being enough to stop plasma blasts, but okay. Trust me," Grace said, leaning in close. "It's always enough. They don't get it. They don't understand what makes us keep going." Back in the Zithir ship, Zalvik watched the human soldiers again, his mind turning over the puzzle that they presented. Their energy, their resilience, it was baffling, almost irrational. The idea that humans fought without calculating each move, without considering whether they'd live to see another day, was beyond anything Zalvik had ever encountered. Every decision was weighed, every option explored, except for one. Humans did not back down. "You're right, Commander," Zira said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "They fight without fear. It's as if they don't even consider their own mortality." Zalvik didn't reply immediately. He leaned closer to the screen, his mind racing. What did that even mean? Why didn't they fear death? And if they didn't, what could they possibly fear? Then it hit him. They didn't fear death, not because they were reckless or mindless, but because they feared losing each other. The bond they shared, those connections, was what fueled them. It wasn't about fear of death, but about the certainty that their fight wasn't just for themselves. It was for their people, for their families, for their very existence. He turned to Zira. "It's not about living for them. It's about protecting the ones they love. They are not afraid to die because they know their death will mean something. They fight for each other, and in that, they are unstoppable." Zira seemed stunned. "So, we fight like that too? For our species? For our people?" Zalvik's mind wandered back to the human soldier, Grace Carter, who had stood against them with such determination. She had the same look in her eyes as every human Zalvik had studied. Defiance, yes, but also something deeper, something almost sacred. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "We fight to conquer. We fight to dominate. We fight for control, but they fight to protect. And therein lies the difference. That is what makes them so dangerous. Meanwhile, Grace was starting to notice the shift in the battlefield. The Zither were starting to regroup, but something was different about their movements. Their once perfect coordination was starting to falter, their attacks less precise. "They're hesitating," Jamal observed, watching the Zither troops falter in the distance. Grace felt a surge of hope rise within her. Could it be? Were the Zither finally starting to understand what they were up against? "Maybe they've realized we're not like them," Grace muttered under her breath. "We're not an enemy you can simply crush and move on from. We live this. We fight for each other. And that, Jamal," she glanced back at him with a grin, "that's something no plasma cannon can destroy." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "You're right, Sergeant. I'm just starting to believe we might actually be onto something here." Grace's smile faded into something more serious, her gaze returning to the looming Zither forces. "Don't get too comfortable. The battle's far from over. But, yeah, I think we've got them on the ropes." And somewhere, high above the battlefield, Zalvik's eyes narrowed as he watched the humans. They were unpredictable, yes, but that was the very thing that made them so dangerous. And the more he observed, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just their courage he needed to understand. It was the very heart of their fight. And that, perhaps, was a lesson the Zither had underestimated. Zalvik sat in the darkness of his command chamber, the only light coming from the soft glow of the control panels. His mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The humans were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Despite everything, despite their primitive weapons and seemingly inferior tactics, they had continued to defy logic. The Zither had studied countless species, conquered hundreds of worlds, but these humans were different. They fought with a passion, an almost maddening level of defiance that Zalvik couldn't comprehend. He reached up and adjusted the display on the wall. The humans were regrouping once more, their lines tight, their will unbroken. Despite the overwhelming odds, they had somehow turned the tide. "How do they do it?" Zalvik muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What makes them continue?" Zira, standing quietly in the corner, observed her commander's growing frustration. "Perhaps, Commander, they are not fighting with reason. Maybe they fight with something more." Zalvik didn't reply right away. The idea had crossed his mind before, but he hadn't been willing to entertain it. What could they be fighting with if not reason, strategy, or sheer survival? "They fight with heart," Zira said carefully, as though testing the words. "Something we cannot measure or quantify. Something that transcends our understanding of battle." Zalvik turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Heart?" He scoffed, as if the notion itself was beneath him. "That's a human notion, not a Zither one. We fight with precision, with power, with intellect." Zira didn't back down. "But perhaps that's where we are wrong. We are so focused on our superiority, our control, that we've ignored the fact that we don't fight for something greater. Perhaps this is why we cannot defeat them." Zalvik's fingers drummed on the surface of the command table, thinking over her words. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to keep emotions in check. But Zira's point gnawed at him. Every time they clashed with the humans, they fought as though each individual life was worth something more. There was an intensity to their struggle, an untouchable bond between them that seemed to drive them past any personal fear. He exhaled sharply. "Then it's not just their bravery. It's their reason for fighting. We've miscalculated the nature of their resistance." Zira nodded slowly, sensing that Zalvik was beginning to see the pattern. "Yes, Commander. They are not fighting for themselves alone. They are fighting for others, for their people. Their strength is in their unity." Zalvik paced back and forth, the weight of this revelation settling heavily upon him. The Zither had always seen unity as a means to an end, efficiency, precision, power. It was never a reason to fight. But the humans, they were different. Their unity didn't stem from obligation or survival. It was born of something far more fragile, something far more powerful. Something that, to Zalvik, was entirely illogical. "They don't fight because they have to," he muttered, as though the thought had only just struck him. "They fight because they choose to. For each other. For their world." for everything they hold dear. Zira, ever the tactical officer, spoke up, but that would mean the more we take from them, the more we destroy, the stronger they'll become. They are willing to give everything, Commander, even their lives. They won't stop fighting until there is nothing left to fight for. Zalvik stopped in his tracks, his jaw tightening. That was the terrifying truth. The humans weren't like other species. They didn't have the same limitations that the Zither had exploited in the past. The idea of sacrificing themselves for a greater cause wasn't a weakness for them. It was their strength. He turned back towards Zira, his eyes narrowing with new understanding. Then we have a problem, he said, his voice colder than before. We've underestimated them. And we've underestimated what their unity can do. On the ground, Grace Carter's team was regrouping, trying to make sense of the strange shift in the battle. The Zither had halted their advance. For a moment, it almost felt like the calm before the storm. The squad members were huddled together, checking their weapons, checking on each other. The familiar rhythm of a post-battle lull. Jamal was the first to speak up. You know what I don't get? They should have destroyed us by now. I mean, they've got better tech, more soldiers. Why haven't they just wiped us out? Grace glanced up from her rifle, an unreadable expression on her face. Maybe they're starting to realize we're not so easily defeated. Maybe they don't understand how we can keep going. Yeah, well, that's their problem, Jamal said, shrugging. The more they hit us, the harder we hit back. They can't figure us out. We're not like any enemy they've ever fought. One of the other soldiers, Anna, chimed in with a tired but determined tone. They're learning. I can see it in their movements. They're adapting to us. But we're not done yet. We've got something they don't understand. Asterisk Heartstar. The heart to fight for each other, for the people we love. It's what makes us different. Grace's smile was faint but filled with pride. Exactly. We don't give up. Ever. And as if on cue, the Zither began to move again. But this time, their attacks were not as coordinated, not as calculated. Something in their strategy had shifted. They were now facing an enemy that would not buckle, an enemy that would not bend, no matter how hard they were pushed. The Zither were now experiencing something they had never encountered before. The sheer persistence of humanity's resolve was starting to take its toll. They had the weapons, the power, the strategy, but the humans had something more, something that couldn't be measured. Grace, Jamal said, his grin wide. You were right. They're scared. Grace shook her head slowly, her eyes glinting with the fire of determination. Not scared, Jamal. They're learning. And that, more than anything, might be our greatest weapon. Up in the Zither ships, Zalvik's mind was racing. The humans had done something he couldn't quite grasp. They had taken something as illogical as their unity and turned it into their greatest strength. And now, as the battle raged on, Zalvik couldn't help but wonder, was there any way to defeat an enemy who had the courage to fight not just for survival, but for something far beyond themselves? He glanced at Zira, his mind made up. Prepare the next phase of the assault. We will see just how far their hearts will take them. But deep down, a part of him knew that this war was no longer just about defeating the humans. It was about understanding the very essence of their fight, something the Zither had never been forced to comprehend before.